Now it looks like I'm recording.
It says recording time.
Okay, well, all right, well, welcome back, everyone, for take 2. We tried on Tuesday, and we had some technical problems. So, in any case, good to see everybody again. For our online students, welcome. I'll post probably another video as well for you, an independent welcome announcement. But the plan for today is to do basically a crash course. So what I would normally do in probably 2.5 weeks of a Monday, Wednesday, Friday 50-minute intro course, try to get through as much of that as I can in today's meeting. That's probably ambitious, and it's okay if we don't get it all done. I'd rather do it well than do it fast. That's the most important thing. So that's the plan. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at the pretest. For the online folks, please take the pretest before next week so that I can see how people are doing. The folks that have taken it, and I looked at the scores briefly, sort of as expected, kind of all over the map. And some of it, I think, is a function of the fact that a fair number of people haven't had me before as an instructor, and so some of the terminology is not my own, but at least it's the terminology that I'm using. So that probably explains a little bit of it, but we'll try to go through that. Before we jump into it all, though, I always like to try to ask if people have questions about anything. It's obviously essentially like the first meeting, so probably not a lot of questions, but anybody got anything? All right, cool. So where to begin? Well, this is just a quote I put up here because I like the quote. I think it's great, Philippa Foot. And I think it does kind of, in a way, sort of summarize how a lot of people feel after being exposed to philosophy, right? I mean, you start with a kind of simple question, and after a little bit of time, non-philosophers are kind of checked out, right? Just sort of wondering what's going on. Now, you, of course, most all of you are philosophy majors or minors or have a serious interest in philosophy, so you get it. But in any case, the simple question one of the simple questions, not so simple, of course, that we'll be thinking about is what is knowledge, right? That's sort of the ground zero question for our course here today and for the rest of the semester. So without further ado, let me go ahead and put up my list of basic terms and concepts. Anybody have this with them? You're welcome. This should be out there. Did people see it? Should be out there on Canvas, available to you. Feel free to download, print out any of the stuff you like, bring it to class with you if it helps you. So again, this is a kind of compressed version for folks that recently had me. A couple people had me last semester. Some of this will be a review, but I encourage you to stop me, raise your hand, ask questions if any of this stuff seems confusing, because although I say it's basic philosophical terms and concepts, I don't presuppose that it's easy stuff, right? A lot of these basic concepts can actually be pretty challenging for folks, even people that have done some philosophy. So I start at the top here with reasoning, but to back up a little bit, how would I normally get there? Well, one thing I have us think about is our basic sources of knowledge. And Feldman's going to talk a little bit about this in Chapter 1, so I won't steal too much of his thunder, but maybe for a few minutes we can try to do this together. And what I have in mind here is to try to construct a relatively short-ish list of our basic ways of getting information about the world. Not necessarily deep philosophical insights, but just any knowledge whatsoever. And I'm not looking for a list of things we know. So you know that the lights are on, you know where you parked your car, you know that 2 + 2 = 4, you know what thought you're thinking right now, right? And a wide variety of different things. Those are all particular instances, let's suppose, of things that you know right now. So I'm not looking for a laundry list of those, but rather how it is that we come by that knowledge, for now on the assumption that we do know these things, right? One of the big parts of what will occupy us this semester is seriously thinking about whether we in fact can ever really know anything, or whether there are particular categories of things that are just denied to us that we can't know. So reasoning, since it's already up there, I'll just say a little bit about it. reasoning is one of what I consider to be the basic sources of knowledge. Maybe I can put that up here for us. Basic sources of knowledge. And what I've got in mind, it's going to turn out five or six, give or take, and you'll see why. So reasoning is definitely on the list. And this sort of armchair definition of reasoning is my own. It's for our purposes here. So it's not a textbook definition. I didn't Google it or get a dictionary. It's just the way I'm thinking about reasoning. So you can kind of synchronize your own thinking to where I'm at, and we can work that way. So I think of reasoning as a mental process, as a psychological process, whereby you've already got some stock of beliefs, some things that you believe, and based on those beliefs that you've got, we then ask ourselves, okay, what either has to be true, what must be the case, or what must follow from that, or what's probably true, right? So reasoning comes in two varieties, and since most folks here have had 310, but you wouldn't have to have had that if you've had practical reasoning, getting ready to be called critical thinking, then you've covered it there as well. So what's one type of reasoning? Deductive reasoning, indeed, right? So we've got deductive reasoning, and I'll say something about the characterization of that here in just a little bit, but a short version of it is that deductive reasoning is reasoning that's designed to guarantee the truth of its conclusion, right? So if all of these antecedent beliefs, 1, 2, 3, are true, then therefore this must be the case. This has to follow. And then there's another type of reasoning that gets discussed a lot as well, which is inductive reasoning. Very good. And these are the two main sorts that I'm going to focus on. Anybody want to try to say what's distinctive about inductive reasoning, or what's the difference between that and deductive reasoning? Yeah, thanks.
It deals with probability rather than unguaranteed.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to try to learn names. So some people I've had before. Your name, please? Aaron. Okay. And then before was Derek. Okay, cool. Great. So Aaron and Derek. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah. So as Aaron says, the one distinctive feature of inductive reasoning is that the conclusions of our inductive inferences aren't guaranteed, right? They're made probable. And I'll just go ahead and say what I'm going to understand or mean by probable is more than 50% but less than a probability of 1. All right? So if it's 51%, that's still probable. Only slightly so. Right? If it's 99.9 repeating, then it's almost a guarantee, right? But it's within that range. And so one thing that you can kind of see already is that when it comes to these inductive arguments, right, arguments that make their conclusions probable, they vary in terms of their strength, right? Whereas so some inductive arguments are stronger than others, whereas in the case of a deductive argument, they're all at least valid arguments. So they all have that in common. You're either a valid argument or you're not. Right? Okay, so that takes care of reasoning, and there'll be a lot more that we'll say as we get further into the course. But again, I just kind of want to get as much of this down as I can. What about another source of our knowledge in general about the world? So perception, yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Good. So perception's up here for sure. And my handwriting's terrible. I apologize in advance. So I'm left-handed, and I use that as my excuse for having horrible penmanship, whether it's legitimate or not. But perception, if you can't read something I write on the board, it won't hurt my feelings. Just raise your hand, and I'll try to say what it is again. And I'll show a typed-up version of this when we get done. It's cleaned up. So yeah, perception. Turns out that a remarkable amount of what we ordinarily take for granted that we know, things we think we know about, at least the immediate environment, the world around us, are arrived at via perception, right? So what am I thinking of there? Well, the 5 senses, right? And again, this breakdown, breaking it apart like this, is kind of oversimplifying things, right? In the sense that these sources of knowledge can work together synergistically. So even though I'm breaking them apart, any real-world instance of something that a person knows is likely to be the result of a whole bunch of these different sources working at different levels. So keep that in mind. So for perception, how is it that I know that the lights are on in the room right now? Presumably I see it. How is it that you know someone's speaking? You hear it. You know whether you're sitting or standing, right? You can kind of sense your own position. Likewise for touch and taste and the others. So here's a point to make. I guess this is a good time to do it. I'm not assuming for any of these things right off the bat that they're infallible. Clearly perception is not, right? I mean, you can seem to see something and turn out to be mistaken. And we'll talk later in the semester about different senses of these words, right? So there is a sense in which if you say Smith perceives the cup on the table, that maybe you're meaning to imply that that's true, that there is in fact a cup on the table. But sometimes when we talk about perceiving, all we really mean to indicate is just how it looks to Smith, that it seems to be that way. So a hallucinatory experience, right, would seem to be one as if a certain way, but it's not. So perception, clearly a fallible source of our knowledge of the world. But that's okay, because as this will become a kind of common refrain, I think, throughout the semester, as much as a lot of philosophers have hoped for some infallible source of knowing, that's a matter of considerable dispute. And it seems like a lot of what we know, if we know it at all, is based on some sort of fallible way of knowing, right? So we've got perception there involving the five senses. What about another one?
Testimony.
Yeah, testimony. So what is that?
Basically, you know something by relying on someone or something else. So from Wikipedia to someone telling you it.
Yeah, thanks. So this is actually, testimony has kind of become a hot topic in recent epistemology, I'd say over the past, 15 years or so. There's been quite a bit of work done by epistemologists trying to figure out exactly what to think about testimony. And normally when I do this part of things, I'll put a little star by it here, and that'll remind me to say some more about it. But Corey's on the mark here. I mean, by testimony, when you hear that word, you immediately think of like the legal notion. So somebody giving their testimony in a courtroom. But that's not, and that is a form of testimony that would fall under what I've got in mind here. And Feldman's going to go through all this as well when you read chapter 1, if you haven't already. But that's just a narrow sense of the word. What I mean, and what most epistemologists have in mind when they talk about testimony, is basically any belief whose primary way of getting at it is via the say-so of some source or other. So if your teacher tells you, your parents tell you, religious authorities, political authorities, if you read it in a book, if you got it off the internet, right? Anything like that's going to count as a form of testimony in the intended sense of the word, right? And so right off the bat, you might think, well, I don't know what I think about testimony. I mean, is it legitimate or not? I mean, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to rely on testimony at all and we could just strike it from the list and make do with some of these other sources? Well, why would somebody think that? Well, you might think the testimony is not a legitimate or bona fide, it's not a real source of knowledge, or it's not basic, because it depends on this extra link in the chain, and you don't have to do a lot of thinking to see that, well, any knowledge that we could arrive at in virtue of testimony is only going to be as good as the source, right? The old adage, consider to the source. So what do we know about the source? Is the source any good? Does the source know what they're talking about? Are they an expert? Do they have an agenda? Is there some sort of built-in bias? So there's been a lot of discussion around those issues and others when it comes to the epistemology of testimony and our knowledge based therein. I guess for my own part, I'm a friend of testimony, partly because I feel like we can't do without it, right? If we were to try to give up testimony altogether, then it would make it really hard to know as much as the standard view, which what Feldman calls the standard view, assumes we do know, right? So even simple things, when you look at a snack bar, a granola bar, and you read the ingredient list on that, right? In some sense, you're taking the manufacturer's word for it, that that's what's in that product, right? Or a box of cereal, you read that and you form the belief that there's, Toasty Flakes inside, and you'd be surprised to open it and find a box of rocks, right? That would not be what one would expect, and yet it's based on the testimony essentially of the manufacturer, and that's how we get that knowledge. Likewise, I mean, when you think about the division of labor, right? What would be involved in each one of us having to individually go and arrive at these claims on our own? It's just overwhelming, right? So much easier from a pragmatic standpoint for me to be able to ask Corey a question and get it from him, get the answer from him, that is, than to have to go behind him and double check everything that he says or just skip him altogether, right? So why do I have this little star by? So let me stop first and see if people have thoughts or questions about testimony. There's a lot here. Yeah, Aaron.
That doesn't make it valid just because it's easier.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's a bad argument. You're right. I appreciate you calling me out on that. Yeah, it's, and I'm sympathetic. I mean, I get that that's maybe not as philosophers, we would like the reason to be something better than just, well, we're stuck with it, or it's expedient, or it'd be too hard to do it the right way. Those seem like bad excuses, and I'm with you on that. But and so that defense of testimony can only take us so far. I think a real defense of it's going to involve trying to respond to critics who have an axe to grind against it, right? And one way to do that would be to try to show, and this might be a topic for a final paper. I'll try whenever the moment seems right throughout the semester. If it strikes me that, hey, here's a paper idea, I'll mention it, and if it resonates with you, you can make a note of it and write it down. We can talk about it in office hours, or you can email me or whatever. But it might be that an interesting way to try to defend testimony would be to take 2 or 3 of the main objections that the anti-testimony people have and try to show that, well, if those objections are any good, then they're also going to infect some of these other sources. And again, that's not a complete defense, because you might, if you're a real skeptic, you might think, well, the other's so much the worse for the other sources too. We just don't really know very much, right? So somebody could bite the bullet, but at the same time, that would be to me kind of a novel way of trying to defend testimony, is to say, well, look, I mean, any of these arguments or objections are also going to apply to certain kinds of reasoning, maybe our inductive inferences, or maybe to perception. So that's something to think about. As far as the little star and why I've got that there, here's one kind of puzzle about testimony. Suppose I want to know what time it is, and so I ask Derek, and Derek tells me it's 2:13 or whatever, right? And I say, oh, that's cool. How do you know? And Derek says, well, I asked Aaron, and Aaron told me it was that time, and I have no reason to doubt what he says. He seems like an honorable guy. He's not out to deceive me. And I said, well, that's great, Aaron. How do you know? And so then Aaron says, well, I got it from, and your name? Say again? Susie, yeah, Susie. And so you see where this is going, right? And we go to Anthony, and we go on around the room, and we get over here to the end, and then finally, well, and your name again? Jamie. I asked Jamie, and Jamie says, oh, well, you told me. But I'm the one who started this whole thing off, right? I mean, I'm the one who asked the original question, what time is it? So one kind of concern about testimony is the possibility of a giant loop, right? That starts to look like circular reasoning, and in general, philosophers aren't fans of circles. Though we'll see later on when we consider different evidentialist theories of justification that some theorists, notably coherence theorists about justification, have tried to argue that, and this is not doing full justice to their view, but in a way that small circles are bad, but big circles could be okay, right? If the circle's big enough and if there are enough different sorts of interconnections, then perhaps it's not so bad. This is the kind of web metaphor, the web of belief metaphor. But in any case, I put the little star here because someone, just to call attention to the fact that it seems like, I mean, I put this on my list, I call it my list, Feldman's list of basic sources of knowledge. I include it, and as I say, I guess I would have to be a friend of testimony, but it does seem like it would have to ground out in something other than just itself, right? It would be nice if ultimately, to go back to that example, when I get to someone somewhere in the room and I say, and how do you know? And they say, well, I looked at the clock on the wall. And that's perception. Now, of course, I might be misperceiving it. Maybe the clock's malfunctioning. any number of things could go wrong from there. But at least testimony wouldn't stand alone as its own source. It would have to kind of ground out. So good, testimony's in there. Anybody got another example of a source? So we're going to talk about evidence. The way I think about evidence is all of these are sources of evidence. All right, so
Rational insight.
yeah, I might wait on that one, but I'll put it up here. Yeah, just go ahead and have it. I'll come back to that one. So rational insight, because this is in some ways the hardest to characterize. I mean, we're philosophers, so people are familiar with reasoning. You've taken logic or critical thinking or whatever. You've done some deductive reasoning. You've proven some things along the way. You've thought a little bit about induction. Same with perception. It's familiar. We use it all the time. We take it for granted, right? Testimony, right? It's everywhere. Rational insight's a little different there. Bless you. But I will say something about it at the end here. So think about this one. Whether you had a cup of coffee this morning. That's something that you know. Either that you did or that you didn't. Probably not having to suspend judgment about that one. You never know. But presumably you know that. Likewise, you know if you drove to campus or if you have a car here, you know where your car is parked. How do you know those things? Yeah, thanks. Memory. Absolutely. I'll put it out here on the side. Yeah, so again, it's so obvious seeming once you think of it, right? But it's easy to take it for granted that a huge amount of what we assume we know about the world is arrived at via memory. And so this, again, is an entire area in cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology. Probably some of you have taken courses where you've studied memory in a different context, and there's lots of interesting scientific work for sure on memory. As a philosopher, my primary interest in it is exactly how it is that seeming episodes of remembering can serve to justify beliefs about the past, right? But it's essentially memory that connects us with our own past experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's a little bit further on, but like my issue, so how you're justified in believing something based off of memory, which for me seems like super fallible.
Yeah.
All that stuff.
All the stuff we know. Yeah.
So if you're like, you think you're justified but you're not, is that really the basic source of knowledge?
So let me make sure I'm following you here. Help me out. So is the worry that memory seems especially prone to error, more so maybe than perception?
Yes. Right?
Or testimony? I don't know. It's hard to know with testimony, right? You can find somebody out there on the web now that'll tell you whatever you want to hear, right? So this one also seems troubling in terms of its reliability or its credentials. And memory, I agree. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a scientist who studies how memories are formed, and there are folks here at the university that do that. Yeah, Jamie.
I guess you could say more short-term memory would be more reliable, just because it's fresher in your mind than trying to remember something that like 5 years ago.
Something that is in the past,
Yeah.
further in the past. Yeah, and again, I mean, it would just be armchair speculation for me to weigh in on that because I'm not an expert in that area. But yeah, I mean, my inclination is to agree that it seems like things that are more recent, we'd be better at recalling them. But we've all at least had some passing experience with how constructive memory is and how unreliable eyewitness accounts are. People, 4 or 5 people watch the same thing happen, and then you go back and talk to them a little bit later, and everybody's disagreeing about the hat the person was wearing, or the color of the shirt, or the sequence of events. So yeah, it's definitely it's concerning. And here's another kind of worry. Suppose it turns out that there's no way to tell from the inside whether or not a memory is genuine or not, right? So this is another thing that I'll go ahead and put out there and share. I'm a film person. I like music and film, as I've said before, and so any opportunity to kind of bring in some sort of Hollywood film example, I'll take that. And there are a lot of interesting plot lines, right? Especially if you're a science fiction person, that make heavy use of this idea of the fallibility of memory, right? So from Total Recall to Blade Runner and lots of others. And there is this kind of concern, and maybe because it would be nice to be able to tell, as it were, from the inside, as if genuine memories had a kind of glow. One of my mentors in graduate school used to describe it that way, as if the reliable ones or the good ones had a kind of luminescent quality, and you could just tell that while you were in the midst of that memory experience or seeming to remember experience. But they just don't, right? So a memory that's unreliable, that's been fabricated or implanted or there as a result of anything from post-hypnotic suggestion to any number of other things that could interfere with one's memory, would seem just as genuine, just as legitimate. So obviously that makes the case for kind of skepticism about our memorial justification even stronger. So if you're interested in that, again, that's a potential paper topic, and there's lots of literature on memory and the epistemology of memory. One thing seems to be clear, that we can think about memory as a kind of two-part thing. There's the experience of seeming to remember something that we all have whenever we seem to remember, right? There's a kind of psychological experience of that, conscious experience of that. But then there's also got to be a causal connection to the actual event, right? So you can kind of think about an initial sort of first pass at analyzing what it is to genuinely remember something as the seeming episode coupled with the correct causal chain. Some philosophers talk about that seeming to remember experience as a quasi-memory. You'll see this out there as a quasi-memory, or like a virtual memory. So it's the seeming component. That's the internal part. That's what you're immediately and directly aware of, is seeming to remember being 7 years old and learning how to do, to ski or play the piano or whatever. Of course, for it to be a bona fide, genuine memory, there needs to be a causal connection, right? Going back from this current episode of seeming to remember all the way back to that actual event in the past. And of course, at any point along the way, the links in that causal chain could become damaged, severed, broken, deviant in various ways. And you might wonder at that point what happens, right? Does that mean that those memories aren't justified anymore if the causal chain can't be correctly reconstructed, or if the subject can't do it? Most of us couldn't do that, right? I mean, I know that Abraham Lincoln was a president. I learned that in grade school, in history class at some point. But I don't remember the details at all, right? But I still know that. I know that Lincoln was a president, even though I can't, at this point, correctly reconstruct the causal chain that would trace back to my sitting in that seat when I was in, third grade or whatever it is. So lots of questions about memory. So like perception and testimony and inductive reasoning, it's a fallible source, right? Good. What about another one? Yeah, Susie. So rational insight, intuition, I'm going to put those together. But yeah, you're right. That's on there. I want to come back to that one. Looks like we've got, how many have I got there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got one more. It's kind of a weird one. It's not weird once you think of it, but it's easy to... Introspection. Yeah. So put it up here. Introspection. And now that I've got the whole list in front of us, I can put a legible version up here for you. All right. So how to think about introspection? You might think, well, what's the difference between introspection and memory? The way I'm thinking about it is that memory is what connects you to your past experiences, right? You have to have had the experience to start with before you can correctly be said to recall it or remember it. But introspection's what allows you to know your current thoughts, current state of mind, right? So you know, for example, what thought you're thinking right now, as well as all the non-intentional states that you're having. So you've got beliefs and desires, hopes and fears, things that take propositions as their objects, so-called propositional attitudes or intentional attitudes. But you've also got what I think of as just sensations. So a certain sensory state, right? So if you're sleepy or tired or anxious or distracted, if you feel a sensation of an itch or a tickle, or a sensation of sweet or sour, hot or cold, these are also parts of the psychological landscape that we experience. And we experience all these things simultaneously, right? So you can be having a certain sensation and also having a certain thought, a belief, as well as a certain desire, right? All of these things can kind of happen concurrently. It's a kind of curious fact about consciousness, right? So introspection, I say here, inner sensing. It's a kind of weird word. I don't know that there's a better one. It has this kind of early modern flavor to it as I think about it, but I can't come up with a better label for it. It seems to be the sort of the analog of perception. If perception's what connects you to the external world, it's how you know about the world beyond just your immediate sensations, right? Then introspection is how you know your internal world. It's how you know what thoughts you're having, what desires, beliefs, sensations, and so on. A curious thing about introspection is whether or not it's fallible. So folks that have had Professor Rosenfeld for early modern, right, spend some time thinking about rationalism and empiricism, right, talking about Descartes and Locke, thinking about whether or not certain beliefs are infallible or incorrigible, right? And so folks like Descartes are part of a tradition that hold introspective judgments in pretty high regard. Right? The idea that you can't be mistaken. You might be mistaken about whether there's a chair out there or a table because that comes through perception. And the five senses are notoriously fallible, or at least fallible. Maybe not notoriously so, right? But introspective beliefs, for a lot of folks, at least traditionally, they've had a different status, right? It seems like, well, I might be wrong about the external environment, but I can't be wrong about my own internal environment. Surely I can know what thought I'm thinking right now. I can know what sensation I'm having. My beliefs formed about those states aren't fallible. This is a matter of debate. I think, it's hard to know how to judge the landscape. I think that the pendulum has sort of swung a little bit, and in the last part of the 20th century, early 21st century, you've got more epistemologists being critical of introspection, thinking that, well, in fact, maybe the case is a little worse than we thought. Maybe not only do we need to go slower with our beliefs about the external world and hold them up to a higher standard of scrutiny, but maybe even our introspectively formed beliefs aren't as solid as we thought. Maybe the footing for them can be criticized as well. I want to leave it open. You'll see what Feldman has to say later on about this, but I'll leave it an open question for now so that you can think about whether or not introspectively formed beliefs are fallible or infallible. Are their epistemic credentials better than, say, perceptually formed beliefs? All right. So then the last thing here, rational insight. What about that? I've got it up here as also a priori intuition or just intuition, as Susie was mentioning. Anybody want to take a stab at what the basic idea is? What sorts of beliefs would, or at least traditionally, would somebody maybe think are the results of an a priori insight? And I may have to say something about the a priori here. We'll see. How many people are familiar with that language, the a priori, a posteriori distinction? Okay, cool. We'll be saying some more about it, but here's an idea. As you kind of run through the list and you think about things that we know, because keep in mind that the idea behind the list is that it be, in some sense, complete, right? That there not be any knowledge that we've got that can't be accounted for by at least one or more of the basic sources here. So, we can leave it, to some extent we can kind of leave it open, the range of our knowledge, what in fact we know. But if there's some stuff out there that it's possible for us to know, then there better be a source or more on the list here that can account for that knowledge, that can explain it. So with perception, we've got the external world. With testimony, we've got what we get from sources around us. With introspection, our knowledge of our own sort of cognitive state, our state of mind. Memory, our own past. Reasoning, didn't really give any examples there, but folks have recently had logic and practical reasoning, so there are plenty. They're easy to come by, right? Think of a kind of simple argument from elimination. There's been a murder. It's a Sherlock Holmes thing, and it was either the butler or the cook, but the butler was out of the country, so therefore it must be the cook, right? So it's either P or Q. It's not P, therefore it's Q. A simple example of a deductive inference there. Likewise for the inductive inferences, right? I've been observing crows forever and a day. Don't ask me why. And every one I've seen has been black, and so I'm thinking about the next crow. I haven't observed it yet. What's it reasonable for me to believe? Probably it's going to be black. Could I get an albino crow? Sure. Could happen. So what kinds of things do we know that still aren't accounted for? Well, consider this one. A equals A. Right? The law of identity. It's pretty basic. It's a pretty simple kind of thing. It's true. Moreover, it's necessarily true. Haven't talked about modalities yet, but we'll get to that here in just a little bit. How is it that you know that A equals A? It doesn't seem like you can perceive it. It doesn't seem like testimony is going to help, because even if somebody tells you that that's true and that it's a necessity, you've got to wonder, well, how do they know? What if they just consulted the witch doctor or the astrologer, right? That's not going to help. So that's no good. Introspection, it's not as though you're introspecting it. Memory, again, it's a source we need, but it can only help with things we've already had the experience of. So you need that first initial episode of coming to see that A equals A. It doesn't seem like you reasoned to it either way, because reasoning typically involves premises, right? So we need to be able to account for simple logical insights, our ability to see that they're true and typically that they're necessarily true. And so philosophers, for lack of a better label, have used different ones throughout history. Rational insight, I think, is fair enough. It's very hard to characterize. It's an ongoing topic within the field right now. So anybody who wants to write about rational insight, the a priori intuition, that's fair game. I'll be happy to help you with that. I've got it up here on the projector as a priori intuition. So the word intuition is kind of loaded, and I use it in my own thinking and teaching. I'll say things like, well, intuitively this, or your intuition, what is your intuition? Consulting intuitions about cases, thought experiments, and things like that. That's a kind of standard method that philosophers, at least within a certain tradition, use. I assume most of you have had courses here where maybe in ethics comes to mind, among other areas, where there'll be a case described. Typically it's a hypothetical case, right? So like the trolley problem or something. And you're asked, after reading the case or hearing it described, you're asked what you think. What should the person do? What's the morally right thing to do? Or would this be morally permissible? Or is this not something that's morally permissible? That seems like an appeal at some level to your intuitions, your stable, reflective judgments about the case. That's a fine use of the word, I think, but it's certainly, when you hear the word intuition, I think for a lot of folks it conjures up something that's a little bit more folksy, maybe is the way to describe it. And I don't mean to imply anything like that. So when you hear people talk about a gut feeling, or I had a bad feeling, or women's intuition, a phrase that gets tossed around sometimes, that's not what I have in mind by using that word. So I have some misgivings about using it a lot, but I will. Rational insight sort of avoids whatever connotations the word intuition has sort of got around it. But again, it's not particularly helpful until we have some characterization of how it works, right? Are all rational insights into necessary truths? That's a hard question. Could there be a fallible a priori? I think the traditional view has been that anytime a person has an a priori intuition or an a priori insight or a rational insight, that they're in contact with some, and I say in contact, it's metaphorical, with some sort of necessary truth. So an insight into a mathematical claim, right? So you're contemplating some mathematical statement, and you have an insight that, hey, this is true, it's a necessity, or that it's not, that it's an impossible claim. Again, a matter of debate within contemporary epistemology. And so for now, I don't want to have to take a stand. I'm going to try to take as few as I have to for our purposes here. So we've got the list, and as I say, it's supposed to be complete in the sense that anything that we actually do know or that it's possible for us to know, we'd like to be able to account for it by, pointing at one or more of these sources. So here's a question for you. Are we done? Have we left anything off? So think about religious knowledge. If you think that there are religious truths, or for that matter, just supernatural claims that we can come to know that are true, can they be accounted for vis-a-vis the operation of one or more of the sources we've got here? Likewise, for some people worry about moral claims, right? Again, this isn't a course in moral philosophy. There are lots of them in our program. Many of you have taken them, I'm sure. You might think, well, wait a minute. I mean, how do we arrive at our moral knowledge, assuming you're not a skeptic about moral claims? Maybe after taking enough courses in ethics, you've become skeptical. But I suspect that, folks think that, hey, there are some things, some basic moral claims that we can come to know. Can all of that be accounted for by appealing to these? One view would be, yeah. I mean, and so how do you do it? Well, as you look around at the different sources that are up here, you could take an entire seminar in graduate school on any of these things, the epistemology of any of them. But when it comes to philosophical knowledge, right, and moral knowledge would be part of that. Presumably, not religious claims would fall under the broader heading of metaphysics, which would be another branch. Looks like the only places we can really turn to are reasoning and rational insight. The rest of these just aren't, it seems to me, going to be of much help, which isn't really all that surprising when you think about it. I mean, when you look at how philosophy gets done. Now, some of what I just said is being challenged as we speak by people that think the natural sciences have some important bearing on answering philosophical questions. And I'm certainly not an anti-scientific person. Much the opposite. I like science and I'm fascinated by it and want to know as much about it as I can. But this idea that we're going to somehow answer philosophical questions by doing science instead of doing philosophy is provocative. It's a challenge to the traditional sort of approach to doing philosophy, which is largely what we've been doing. This is sort of armchair stuff, right? And for lots of different reasons, there's been a kind of push, I'd say, over the last 30 years or more, to at least think about whether or not cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, computing, and a host of other areas, linguistics and so on, can give us interesting insights into some of the philosophical questions that come up in connection with these different things. All right, so there's our list of basic sources. If I'm right, and again, I haven't really defended it, but suppose we're on the right track and that reasoning and rational insight are the primary ways in which philosophers, at least within this sort of analytic tradition, have gone about doing philosophy, then setting aside rational insight for right now, thinking about reasoning, what is the goal of reasoning? Well, seems like it would be to come to know the truth about whatever the topic is, right? Whether you're reasoning about which major you should select, or which school you should attend for graduate school, or any number of other things. Anything could be a suitable topic for reasoning. So this brings us to the next thing on my list here, which is this stuff about truth. All right. So I've labeled this the objective theory of truth, and this corollary, this counterpart to it, the one truth value principle. And these are just labels that I've attached to the views to make them easy to kind of remember what the view says. In the literature, if you were to take a look at it, the objective theory of truth is often described as the correspondence theory of truth. Have folks heard of this before? At some point, maybe? This is another sort of, as an aside, a pedagogical aside, something that I'm interested in is trying to figure out whether we're teaching folks what we need to be teaching them, right? Since there are various committees that look into this in terms of our majors. And certainly for people that are going to be taking the capstone course in philosophy, that's the sort of the ultimate culmination of your philosophical education here. One of the things we want to see is, are our students getting what they need? And so it's important to me to kind of ask along the way to see what people have been exposed to. And that's another reason why I ask you to take the pretest. So if you haven't done the pretest, please do before our next meeting. Many of you have. So this objective theory of truth, it's often goes under the moniker of the correspondence theory. It's not my theory. It's not Feldman's theory. If you had to kind of trace it to some authorship, I guess it would go back to Plato and Aristotle. You can find the seeds of the theory there. And the theory, it's fairly simple in a way, but like most philosophical things, what starts off simple gets more complicated as you start to kind of ask questions and puzzle over it. The basic idea behind the objective theory of truth is that truth is a correspondence between a statement, also known as a proposition, and a state of affairs. So take a simple example. I'll use my Tate Street coffee cup, my handy demonstrator cup here. The cup is on the table. So consider that statement, that proposition, right? Something, and by proposition, I just mean something that can be true or false. Not everything can be true or false, right? This eraser can't be true or false. It can be a certain color. It can be located in a certain place. But truth and falsity is just not one of the properties that applies to the eraser. Truth or falsity is a property that applies to some things, though, right? These are things that are truth valuable. So statements are propositions. So consider the statement, the cup is on the table, all right? According to OTT, the objective theory of truth, that statement, that proposition is true if and only if what? What condition has to be satisfied? Yeah, simple, right? It's kind of like the redundancy theory. It seems so obvious and simple. How could anybody get confused or puzzle over this? So the cup is on the table is true if and only if a certain state of affairs in the world obtains. And of course, I'm a horrible artist. I can't draw very well. But what I'm drawing here, or attempting to draw, is a little table with a little cup on it. And that's just some chalk marks on a chalkboard, right? But I mean, the real state of affairs that I mean to indicate is right there. In this case, it's a particular concrete state of affairs, an actual state of affairs. And it obtains, right? So the states of affairs aren't true or false. They're obtaining or non-obtaining. And you can talk about actual states of affairs as part of a space of possible states of affairs, a wider space, right? So here we've got the cup on the table, and my little representation of it. Now, of course, when you start to consider more complicated propositions, again, questions kind of come up. So consider the second one there, 2 + 2 = 4. I haven't drawn anything on the other side. I sometimes in the past have kind of imagined a kind of invisible arrow mapping from the proposition over to the corresponding state of affairs in the world, what we would call the truth condition or the truth maker. It's what makes that proposition true in cases where it's true, right? In the case of 2 + 2 = 4, I don't have anything over there, not because I'm skeptical. I'm not a mathematical skeptic. I think that's true. It's necessarily true. But the state of affairs that makes it true, assuming some sort of Platonism about our mathematics, which is controversial in itself, is some sort of abstract state of affairs. It's not a concrete arrangement of physical stuff in the physical world. It's an arrangement, if at all, of numbers, right? These abstracta. Likewise, for these other examples here, look at Smith is thinking about Starbucks. Well, I guess you could try to draw a little picture of Smith and then have a little thought balloon, like in a comic strip, and have the little thought inside the balloon. But again, these aren't taking us very far, right? I mean, depending on some hard questions involving the mind-body problem, perhaps it's some physical arrangement, some physical state of affairs that makes it true that Smith's thinking about Starbucks when he or she is. But it might be some state of a Cartesian substance, like a soul, an immaterial thing, right? This is, again, an open question within the philosophy of mind. How about this moral claim? Torture is morally wrong. A lot of folks might subscribe to that, think that that's true. Torture is morally wrong or never morally justified. A claim about right and wrong, if you're not a moral skeptic and you think that sometimes moral statements express truths, then there seems to have to be some sort of truth maker over here, according to OTT at least. And then likewise here for God exists. So the point I'm trying to make here isn't that these aren't meant to be objections to the correspondence theory of truth so much as just an acknowledgement that the truth makers need not be picturable and need not be concrete states of affairs according to this theory. Now you might say, well, hey, I'm out at this point. I like the concrete states of affairs, and I'm going to try to do my entire ontology using nothing but concrete arrangements of stuff, right? And people have tried this sort of thing, often known as nominalists, right? Have tried to kind of go that way. But in any case, that's the idea behind the objective theory of truth. Let me put it back up here. What makes it objective? Why do I call it that rather than just the correspondence theory or redundancy theory or something like that? Well, I want to emphasize, and again, this is something that I would spend more time on in a first course than a 300-level course, but I still think it's worth going over because people might have questions. And seeing these things presented from different points of view, it can be valuable. What's objective about it is that it says that truth is a relationship between a statement or a proposition and the way the world is. That's it, period. It doesn't say that truth depends on what you think or feel, whether it would suit your purposes or not, whether it would benefit you in some way. All these other proposals, and there are many out there, right? People have said lots of different things about truth, some in philosophy and some in other areas. You might think that truth's even kind of been under attack within the academy for some time now. Not so much within analytic philosophy circles, but certainly within critical theory circles. There have been some critics, vocal critics of theories of truth. And I don't want to, again, I'm not going to take a stand on it. I'm going to use this as kind of my default theory. I'm going to fall back on this. Feldman uses something kind of like this. He calls it the correspondence principle in other places. But that's the source of its objectivity, right, is that it doesn't depend on our thoughts or feelings. Notice that there's no, and this is another thing that people say a lot of times, especially when it's a controversial thing that people get, there'll be disagreement about. People say, well, it's true for Bill, but it's not true for Mary. Can something be true for one person and not true for another person? I mean, well, I'm glad I asked the question. So yes, what do you think, Derek? I mean, yeah. So different.
Were you just generalizing, or?
Well, it's partly rhetorical and partly serious. I mean, because I think this is fun stuff to think about. I mean, so suppose we're talking about abortion, and Smith says abortion is always wrong. And then Jones says, no, it's not the case that abortion is always wrong. Sometimes abortion is morally permissible. Well, it looks like there's a genuine disagreement there. Somebody might sense an impending uncomfortable situation and rush in and say, well, hey, it's going to be all right. It's true for you that abortion's always wrong. It's not true for you, right? Get to have our cake and eat it too. Does that really work? Does it help? Aaron, and then to Anthony.
I don't think it does, because if two people can both have truth and their truths contradict each other, then there's no way to resolve that. It has to be grounded in something outside the two.
Yes, I mean, I think we're on the same page, right? I mean, it'd be worrisome on pain of some sort of contradiction, because it looks like if we're not careful, we'd be able to arrive at a contradictory state of affairs here, where they both turn out to be right, and yet they're disagreeing with each other, and that's a contradiction. So it's worrisome. Anthony.
Oh, I got it a little bit. I thought you were saying, I don't know, something like Brad and Mary, like Mary really did, Brad doesn't. So, but
one wants to keep their kid, and the other doesn't. Yeah, no, okay, I appreciate it. Yeah, so I mean, so here's my way of dealing with the true for stuff, and you guys can think about it and see, if it seems right. I think for any case where you want to say it's true for one person but it's not true for the other person, what we could do is just take out the true for and just substitute in believes. So instead of saying that it's true for Smith but it's not true for Jones, why not just say Smith believes it and Jones doesn't believe it? Because then we have a difference in belief. And that's perfectly okay. People disagree about stuff all the time, right? I mean, that's part of what's going on in philosophy. It's rife with disagreement, right? Even the experts disagree constantly. And that's either something you really like and find, endlessly fun and fascinating, or something that's really frustrating because there seems to be no way to answer the question and get consensus. And people react in different ways. I think that there are a couple different ways you can handle these puzzles about different things being true for different people. Here's a kind of example. Suppose we're thinking about music, and Smith says Metallica is the greatest band in the world. And then Jones gets excited and says, no, it's Lynyrd Skynyrd. Right? So we've got Metallica and we've got Lynyrd Skynyrd, and we're arguing about them. Maybe there, an easy way to resolve it is to say, well, look, unless you're really arguing about the objectivity of the merits of the bands, maybe all you really mean to say by saying that Metallica's the best is something like Metallica's my favorite. So saying Metallica's the best is just elliptical or just a shorthand way of saying it's my favorite one. And then Jones says, Lynyrd Skynyrd's my favorite, or is the best. That's all they're saying, right? Is that it's their favorite. So again, two people can have different favorites. It's chocolate ice cream, vanilla ice cream. There's no problem there. Now, if it's a case of genuine disagreement, we can't get out of it that way, right? I mean, suppose people are saying, well, I didn't mean to just express a preference here. I'm not just talking about my favorites. I mean to be talking about abortion itself. And on the assumption that there's a moral fact of the matter, that it's either never morally permissible or sometimes is, then it looks like you've got a case of genuine disagreement. I think there, the right way to go is to use take out the true for and put in the belief part, and then move to the next phase, which is trying to see if we can make any progress on the moral status of abortion. That's a philosophical problem. That's a real issue, right? So that's an important thing to clear up about the objective theory of truth. A corollary of the view is what I call the one truth value principle, OTV. And this combines two kind of classical views about truth from antiquity. The first is the principle of non-contradiction, which says that basically a statement and its negation can't both be true at the same time. So anything of this form, P, and it's not the case that P, that's an explicit contradiction. Can't have that, right? Another principle that's embedded in this idea is the principle of the excluded middle, which says that every statement is either true or its negation is true. There aren't any statements that are both true and not true. That's non-contradiction, right? And there's no third option. The middle is excluded, right? So there's no true, not true, and maybe, or halfway, or fuzzy, or something within some interval, or undecided or indeterminate. Now, again, you might think that we should give up on the law of excluded middle, and some people certainly have investigated the prospects for doing that, right? You might think that, look, there are just some statements that are indeterminate, and that's not just a feature of our ignorance, right? I mean, one kind of indeterminacy is an epistemic sort, right? There's a fact of the matter, but we just don't know what it is. We can't tell, right? But you might think that actually there are some situations where you can know everything there is to know, and there's still just no fact of the matter, right? That the vagueness is genuine in a case like that. And that perhaps we need to give up the law of excluded middle and embrace a multi-valued logic. Some people have considered that. For our purposes, I'm not gonna try to do that. I hope we can get by with what we've got. We'll see. If people are interested in questions about fuzzy logics and vagueness and want to think more about that indeterminacy stuff, then see me, and that could be a potential paper topic for you. There's been a bit written about it recently. Timothy Williamson is an epistemologist who's worked on this quite a bit, and it's interesting stuff to think about. So questions about, again, I could go on and say a lot more, but in the interest of trying to get as much of this covered as I can, I want questions, thoughts. Feeling pretty good? Yeah, Aaron.
I have a question about before this, the sources.
Yeah.
It seems to me that memory is not actually a source. It's more like a maintenance of knowledge, because you're going back to what your first source was. Like if it's, say, somebody asks you, were the lights on today, and you said, yes, I remember them.
Yeah.
But how did you remember that in the moment you saw them? And that's you're just basically going back to perception.
To perception. Yeah. So it seems like a similar kind of thing with testimony, maybe, right? Yeah. Well, there's a paper I can put you on to. I'll send me an email or see me after class, and I'll try to give you the reference to it. But that may be something you want to write about, because whether or not memory is a kind of standalone source or a generative source, or whether it's just sort of something that only serves to maintain and preserve is an issue. So yeah, good that you pointed that out. Alrighty. Well, in the interest of moving us forward here, this little part right here about the necessary contingent and the impossible. Are folks pretty familiar with this? I mean, I'm assuming so. So, in addition to propositions being things that can be evaluated in terms of truth or falsity, philosophers have long noted, although there's disagreement, like everything in philosophy, there is disagreement. But one tradition, and a fairly dominant one, says, well, look, we can also think about whether or not a statement has its truth value of necessity or only contingently. So the idea is that we've got statements or propositions. These are typically expressed by declarative sentences in English. I'll just stick with English, but it would work for any natural or formal language. You can usually pick out these things as that clauses. So that it's sunny outside, that we're in a room with other people, that the lights are on, that 2 + 2 = 4. All of these are that clauses in English that express propositions that can be things that can be true or false. And so in addition to being true or false, we can then ask, okay, it's true, but does it have to be that way? Does it have to be true? Could it have had a different truth value under different circumstances? Or, okay, it's false in the real world, let's say. People talk that way a lot of times, right? So in the actual world, it's false, but can we imagine a circumstance? I'll use this language. I'll go ahead and say it now. A possible world. And there's a lot of things I could say about possible worlds, and some of it I will along the way. But the short version is that I don't mean to imply or take a stand on the status of that talk. So when I talk about possible worlds, I'm just thinking of it's a heuristic device. It's a way of speaking. And if you want to think about, well, what is it really that we're committing ourselves to when philosophers wave their hands and say, well, imagine a possible world where people have wings, or imagine a possible world where, there's a lot of that gets done in all areas of philosophy, as far as I can tell. So maybe some more than others, but certainly in metaphysics, that comes to mind, and in philosophy of language and in epistemology, we have use for possible worlds semantics. So you might wonder, okay, take a statement that the lights are on in this room. That's true, I suppose, right? Is it contingently true or necessarily true? Well, presumably it's a contingent truth. It's true, but we can easily imagine a way things might have been where that statement would no longer be true. Tell a story. People never existed. There's no building. There's no room. All the stuff's exactly the way that it is, except that we didn't have class today, and so the lights stayed off instead. The electricity, power goes out. So we can, and again, you may say, well, I'm just not comfortable with this because there's a lot of hand waving here. What do you mean, just imagine a way things might have been? That doesn't sound very rigorous. Doesn't sound very scientific, right? And yeah, I agree that there's a lot of hard questions that come up in connection with this approach to doing philosophy, but you've had enough philosophy courses at this point, probably, to know that that's part of a method that philosophers use. We appeal to these things, right? We say, well, consider a possible world where the following is true, and you state the case, right? And then you ask, okay, well, what do you think about this or that? And you use that possible situation as a way of trying to gain some insight to testing a theory one way or the other, right? Anthony. Yeah, similar kind of thing, right? So what if this, what if that? Again, kind of imagining a hypothetical way things might have been. So here's the rough idea. A necessary statement is a statement that's true and not possibly false. An impossible statement is a statement that's false, not possibly true. A contingent statement is a statement that's either true or false, but its truth value could have been different if things had been different in the requisite way. All right? So a whole lot of what we are ordinarily occupied with, thinking about, turn out to be contingent truths. That you're registered for this course. That you're in this classroom, right? That you've got 2 arms and 2 legs, thankfully. Right? These are all contingent truths. What does that mean? Well, that's just to say that they're true, but we can imagine a way things might have been. Whether you want to make it an alternate history and try to do it that way, or the point though is to be aware that the kind of possibility that's at issue here is logical possibility. There are different kinds of possibility. Epistemic possibility is what's possible given what we know, or maybe what we are justified in thinking we know. Nomological possibility is possibility given the laws of nature, or what we take to be the current laws of nature, right? Technological possibility is what's possible given the current technology, right? Logical possibility is the broadest kind of possibility. Logical possibility is anything that doesn't violate the laws of logic, right? So that's pretty broad. And that's typically the one that philosophers go for. Why is this all important? Well, a lot of different reasons. One is that philosophers have tended to be interested in necessary truths, trying to discover, if we can, deeper facts about things rather than just contingent facts, right? And again, this sounds kind of like I'm giving short shrift to the contingent truths and their discovery and investigation, and I'm not. I mean, you can think of science as being actively engaged in that kind of inquiry, right? We're trying in physics and chemistry and biology constantly to learn more about the nature of the physical world. And these are, in many cases, we'll discover laws of nature as a result, right? These scientific truths, though, are nomological truths, right? They're truths that are undergirded by the facts of the world that we live in, presumably, had the laws of nature been different, there'd be different observations would be possible, different things would be true, right? So bear that in mind. When philosophers ask what is truth, or what is justice, or what is right action, what is knowledge, what is consciousness, what they seem to have had in mind, and I kind of harken back to tradition here. When you think about Plato, those early Platonic dialogues where you've got Socrates and he's walking around Athens and he's asking the authorities these different questions. What's he trying to get at? Well, he's wanting to know not just which acts are pious or just, right, but about the nature of piety or justice. What is it that they all... And the thought is, the assumption perhaps is that there has to be something that all just acts have in common, in virtue of which they're just. Likewise, there seems, and by extension, for our case, is there something that all instances of knowledge have to have in common that binds them together? A traditional answer is, well, yeah. I'm not going to say they constitute a natural kind. That's to stretch a phrase there, but the idea would be that, look, here's an instance of knowledge, and here's an instance of knowledge, and there's one over here. What is it about all of those that gets them properly grouped under that one heading, as opposed to just a bunch of lucky guesses? Right? Seems like there's got to be something deeper. So that's part of the interest in exploring necessity for philosophers. I can probably skip through some of the stuff here on arguments. We're all familiar with what they are. I'll think about them as a set of structured statements, some of which are premises and some of which are intermediate conclusions or final conclusions. This gets us down here to a kind of formal account of arguments. I can show you my own sort of hierarchy here. Very simple. So at the highest level, we've got arguments. To be an argument, there has to be at least one thing that's a premise and one thing that's a conclusion. They divide into well-formed and ill-formed. This is just on the side of the structure of arguments. The well-formed arguments divide further into the valid arguments. These are examples of deductive reasoning, or what I'm going to call cogent arguments. These are examples of inductive reasoning. Now, a word about the terminology. There's no debate about what we should call deductive arguments that have a certain form, right? In other words, a form where if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. That's what it is to be a valid argument, right? But there's never really been any consensus among philosophers as to what we should say about the corresponding inductive arguments in terms of their formal structure. Induction's just not as more unwieldy than deduction. And so there's been different terminology. I'm going to use this idea of cogent. Some people would use it to mean something different, so just be aware of that. So cogent is the inductive counterpart of valid for our purposes. So a valid argument is one. Again, we've got the definitions down here at the bottom. Hopefully everybody remembers this. Different ways of saying it, but either one where if the premises were true, hypothetically, then the conclusion would have to be true. Or another way of saying it, it's necessarily true that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Either of those will work. And again, this is just all on the side of an argument's form. It has nothing to do with the actual content of the argument. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a list. And again, all of this should be out on Canvas for you. Just to have an example, because I'm still sometimes amazed at how hard it can be for people to grasp the concept of validity, and that's kind of like the foundational concept for doing philosophy, right? So if there's one thing we want our majors to definitely know when they graduate, it's what a valid argument is. So here's a set of examples. All of these arguments have the same form, right? They're all A's are B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B, or something like that, using predicate logic notation. But notice that the actual truth values from premises to conclusion can be all over the map, right? So you can't tell whether or not an argument is valid or not just by looking at the actual truth values of the premises or the conclusion in isolation from each other. Bottom line is it's a package deal. Hopefully everybody here knows that by now. One example that I'll mention here that sometimes kind of works on people, is that you can have a valid argument with all false premises and a true conclusion. That's kind of weird, right? I mean, you might think, well, wait a minute, I don't get that. How can that be? Well, the reason, again, is because if these premises were true, then this conclusion would have to be true. Notice that because of the propositions that I've selected, it turns out that this conclusion is true in the real world for reasons that are completely unrelated to the premises here. All women are rock stars, Bob Dylan's a woman, therefore Bob Dylan's a rock star. Well, no, I mean, the premises are false, the conclusion's true, but the argument's still a valid argument, right? And that's really important to notice. All right, I'm right at my time, so I'll stop. Thanks, folks. I appreciate it. If you haven't taken the test, take the test. See you on Tuesday.